Welcome to this special lecture. I'm excited to introduce you to Sarah Fox. Sarah is currently a PhD candidate at University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering program. Sarah has a master's degree in digital art from Georgia Tech. Her undergrad degree was in film studies, English, and telecommunication art. Yeah. So Sarah's research focuses on the social and political conditions of technology development, from feminist hackerspaces to menstrual product infrastructure. Sarah also uses innovative methods from zines to design parody, which hopefully we hear from. And also her award-winning papers can be seen at the top venues such as ACM's CSCW, CHI, and DIS. Super excited to have her here at School of Information. Please welcome Sarah Fox.
Thank you, Kamiko, and thank you, everyone, for such a warm welcome. I've felt quite at home here talking with you all about the research that you've been doing here and the teaching that happens here in the School of Information, and I'm excited to share a little bit more about what I've been working on over the past couple years. So as Kamiko mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington, but also, as of a month ago, I'm a visiting researcher in the Hybrid Ecologies Lab with Eric Palos back in the back of the room, and EECS just across the way. So I'll be traveling back a mile and a half away to where I'm staying after this. But I'm delighted to be here and spend the day with you all. So the work I'm going to talk about today is about design at the periphery, or efforts to probe existing structures of dominance by building critical alternatives through design and technology development. So this approach is not solely about technological outcomes, but rather is about using techniques of design to understand and sometimes question social and political phenomena. Specifically in this talk, I'll look at two cases from my doctoral work. One, interrogating data-driven mapping through the deployment of a fictional company, a project I call Parity in Place. The other, called Riot, examines the intersection of public resource distribution and technologies linked to the Internet of Things, or ubiquitous networked objects imbued with computational capacity. Finally, I'll conclude the talk by discussing ongoing work that builds on these programs of research, as well as future projects I plan to conduct over the coming years. So my research sits at the intersections of information and design, where critical interpretivist modes of investigation are interwoven with programs of design research. So in my work, I combine a deep understanding of people, derived from ethnographically oriented fieldwork, along with the creation of artifacts informed by traditions of infrastructural inversion and critical design. So infrastructural inversion was developed by science and technology studies scholars Jeff Bowker and Susan Lee Starr, and it offers analyses uncovering the practical politics of local mundane sites and everyday tools. So infrastructure might ordinarily be hidden to all but those who care for it, but inversion opens up or reverse engineers how it shapes and is shaped by political and social conditions. So taking up this lens of inversion, I'll show later, we can learn much about IoT, for instance, by examining the institutional conditions of its maintenance. Critical design, on the other hand, is a mode of interrogation that leverages the production and demonstration of design artifacts to form argumentation. So rather than, say, consumer products. It initially evolved and emerged out of the Royal College of Art in London, which is a kind of an art and design school with a capital D and a capital A. And then has since kind of been incorporated into HCI work more broadly in design research. So an example of this is a suite of robots who express fear, nervousness, and attachment, produced by Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby. And these technologies are cast as cohabitants rather than kind of the servants that we might imagine them today. And it kind of offers an image of the future that is interdependent between humans and non-humans. So together, these approaches of ethnographic study, infrastructural inversion, and critical design help reveal the social conditions that shape and are shaped by technology. So in bringing these techniques and methods together, I complement existing critical approaches by not only critiquing status quo arrangements, but by also offering critical alternatives. So I put something forward for others to puzzle, critique, and build upon. I put my own skin in the game, so to speak. So operating at this juncture of information and design, my research focuses on a major challenge for tech development, namely a propensity to construct a universalizing image of the user, or a sort of top-down view of who counts. So at one level, we can attribute this to this tendency to leaner production cycles, only focused on the most lucrative of consumers or forms of interaction. At another level, we can trace this to the popularization and commodification of design methods themselves, kind of circulated by prominent firms like IDEO or Cooper, far and wide, from business schools to international NGOs. So the idea is if you follow these key steps or use these branded design cards, no matter the context, innovation can happen. So these methods introduce a sense of participatory design process or co-production, but it's important to note that this participation is carefully managed and even prescribed in some cases to support later storytelling to stakeholders or investors and to combine a kind of ethical and economic interest. So I highlight this tendency not to condemn kind of techniques of HCD or UCD, but to focus on what's lost in these practices as these practices become normalized and regularized. So looking at what is obscured in the construction of the user, or the key stakeholder, or the development of personas, say. So in this conversation, my research interjects to ask, what might it mean to pull back from this tight focus on sites of potential consumer value to instead look toward the periphery, where one might explore the absences formed by these dominant practices and how design interventions themselves might be used to expand our range of view, not through prescription, but rather experimentation. So taking up this question, I've looked at a variety of different sites of technological and critical intervention on daily life, from studying the development of feminist hackerspaces established to contest mainstream technology development, to building formats of research dissemination at the periphery of academic production through zines or short-run publications. So these are works that I would be delighted to talk at length about after this talk. But today, I'll focus specifically on two cases that I've done most recently. One on data-driven mapping, and the other on infrastructures of care and IoT. So by interrogating and leveraging digital mapping and IoT technologies, I look at the quality of these sites as they stretch across quality of these designs as they stretch across sites of intended and unintended use. So in these case studies, data-driven mapping is revealed to contest and propagate institutional forces and material complexities that define movement through public space, while IoT structures experiences of hygiene access. So I'll first begin by discussing the mapping project and then delve a little bit further into IoT. But before all of that, I'm going to start by telling you a story on how on and offline maps meet. So during the early stages of investigating forms of database mapping, I became captivated by mixed reviews of a Japanese garden I'd encountered on Yelp. This is a 20-acre public garden that sits at the south of the city of Seattle in a neighborhood called Rainier Beach. It's a largely working-class neighborhood with a majority of non-white residents, one of the few neighborhoods like it left in Seattle City proper. So over the past several years, hiring from large tech firms has prompted a dramatic rise in housing costs and resultant shifts in demographics of the neighborhoods of the city's core, and the displacement of many populations who had inhabited this space over decades. So some of the reviews of the garden both praised its expansiveness and complained of the, quote, sketchiness and broken car glass in the parking lot. One representative review described the park as beautiful and then added, too bad the neighborhood is a bit sketchy. And some reviews rejected the neighborhood altogether, such as one noting, the garden should be your only reason for visiting Rainier Beach unless you know someone who lives there. So the beauty of the Japanese garden was seen as an exception rather than the rule for the neighborhood. So to investigate these representations, I set out to visit the garden with a friend, Michael, one afternoon. So he chose to reserve a car through the car rental company Car2Go. And he'd used the service many times before to travel north or to visit big box stores around where he lived in the city's core. But after driving a couple miles south, the Car2Go began to beep. The display in the center console alerted him that he was approaching territory out of range for the service. So he turned the car around, found a parking spot just within the allowed area, which was about 2.5 miles from the garden. Yet the Seattle city limits extended for at least another 10 miles. So it seemed Car2Go was inscribing its own geographic boundaries. But how had they been drawn, and by whom? And why this seemingly arbitrary geographic boundary aligned with no particular state-driven regulation? So after a fair amount of walking and a long bus ride, we eventually enjoyed the garden. But this experience prompted me to explore a bit further. So I found one article citing Car2Go's then head of North American Communications, who explained their rationale for the exclusion. Basically, the way it works is that in every city, we identify through market research where people are living, working, and going to school the most. If it's a new and developing area, maybe that doesn't show up. Which begs the question, new and developing to whom, and toward what ends? So compared against demographic data for the city, Car2Go seemed to circumscribe a socioeconomic boundary. So the median household income for Rainier Beach dips below the citywide number by about 20,000. It also, in the latest census, represented one of the most diverse neighborhoods in all of the country. So of course, the algorithms or market research generated by Yelp and now Car2Go not only remained invisible to users, but also shaped perceived neighborhood boundaries. Recognizing this, I wondered, what would it take to make this power relationship more broadly visible? And to use that visibility to engage in discussion with those designing these platforms. In an effort not to place blame necessarily, I'm not interested in doing that, but instead to kind of engage in dialogue and in an effort to move toward ways of changing this. In parallel to this, I began to notice a particular set of imagery emerging again and again in tech firms, on the walls of design bookstores, and even emulated in the work of my students. These were maps produced by the design company Orc Posters, depicting cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco through the typographic neighborhood mapping techniques. So essentially using the neighborhood names to fill up the bounds of the city, as you can see on this screen here. Dog patch might fill in a particular bound in a unique and interesting typographic arrangement. So the evocative nature of the posters kind of seemed to appeal to designers. These were everywhere at the time of the study. I see some heads shaking. So it was a clean, kind of modernist aesthetic that was popular then and even still now. So seeing this trend, I thought perhaps this might be a way of engaging designers in conversations on mapping and disparity that I've been having among my collaborators in a small group. So rather than taking up kind of exploratory data analysis tool that exists already, I chose to use an evocative and familiar visual language in order to have this conversation. So critical data study scholars not only call for the exploration of measurement, so how data classifications may make the world conform to abstract categorizations, but also for the need to further engage with the particular politics they expose. So rather than treating data as a neutral or raw resource waiting to be assembled, the intervention that follows uses design research approaches to explore how all data produce new worlds within and around them. Questions that Jenna and Deidre have been exploring ethnographically or through policy. So drawing on this work, as well as expanding programs of design research that leverage levity and irony, I developed a fictional company called Dork Posters, emulating org posters. So the intervention comprised of a set of marketing materials, including a website, contact cards, and a set of posters. So this project expands org's original focus on different cities to include their representation within digital platforms, such as Yelp, Zillow, and Car2Go. So like org posters, Dork Posters depict small typographic compositions in the shape of city neighborhoods. Unlike the original, when you encounter the parody, the typographic arrangements are automatically generated with data from platforms reliant on forms of mapping. So with Yelp, it's the results of its best match algorithm. With Zillow, it's a Zestimate, or estimated home value for a particular area. And with Car2Go, it's the number of cars available to rent in a particular zone. So in the university district where the University of Washington sits, the map reads Morsel, which is the name of a gourmet biscuit restaurant. So it's not the university. So on top of all of this, when one encounters the maps on the Dork Posters website, they're also given the option to view a layer showing racial distribution of the city. So specifically, Dork Posters mapping tool is comprised of an API query of Yelp, Zillow, and Car2Go for each Seattle neighborhood, a shape file describing the neighborhood bounds, and a custom text positioning algorithm that displays the results of each query into the shape of the bounds in the manner of org posters. So in doing this, Dork Posters resembles to a certain degree word or tag clouds, so visual representations of text that adjust in font size and color based on the importance of each word. So this is work, obviously, that Marty knows well and has examined, and has shown that though they may not be the most readable in terms of extracting useful information out of them, they are useful in terms of sparking conversation and gathering around socially. So the maps for each platform then represent particular Seattle neighborhoods with typographic arrangements to invite inquiry into what technology corporations make matter and where, moving questions that bubbled up during the Car2Go episode into broader view. So I used Dork Posters to spark discussion on data-driven mapping with dozens of designers and technologists across the city of Seattle, most notably at two public events, one at a data science meetup and the other at a design meetup or design workshop at a local technology firm. So in doing so, I drew from approaches in anthropology on studying up or sideways, so conducting research with folks demographically similar to oneself in order to gain insight into the bureaucratic structures and practices that are otherwise occluded when only studying those affected by their policies or practices, so the user, essentially, in this case. So during one particular encounter, I was in touch with representatives of a local interaction design organization who were hosting a workshop on public design over the course of a summer. And there, they invited me to set up the posters for demonstration and engage with visitors on the topic of mapping. So over the course of the evening, I interacted with a number of workshop goers who expressed both intrigue and puzzlement at the typographic arrangements. Many described kind of ad hoc theories of data sourcing alongside simple expressions of familiarity, so noting their own takes on data provenance. So one technologist from the hosting firm struggled to make sense of a phrase that made up his home neighborhood on the Yelp map. Alkai Sewer? Is that what it says? He was disappointed to learn that his neighborhood was associated with a sewage company. Seeing a disconnect with his own experience of the place and its representation on the map, perhaps in a similar way to those in Rainier Beach who might encounter their representations online. So in another example, one designer who stood with me for nearly the entire time that I was exhibiting studied the Yelp and Zillow maps, comparing and reading across each one of them, and comparing them with experience of his own daily life. So toward the end of our encounter, he suddenly announced, "Oh, they're reductionist," as if he'd solved the puzzle. So almost as soon as I set up, Alan, a 30-something-year-old director of a local design organization, challenged me to explain what product or solution I was presenting, if not posters, as he initially had expected. So while navigating the Zillow map, he took issue with its simplistic depiction of gentrification based on race. There's more to this conversation, he said, pointing to how this map may have changed based on where public transportation infrastructure was built, what level of education people had, and so on. Alan then used the Seattle neighborhood of Columbia City as an example of where one could chart the Zestimate over time and see, quote, the moment the light rail gets in there, the property value may change and start the process of gentrification. There's a lot more data. There's a million more things to look at, he explained. So his insistence on this shortcoming shifted as he learned that I'd hoped to use the tool to promote this very conversation. Instead, he suggested that the project start a Slack channel to gather the conversation with the public more broadly. So Alan's insistence that there was more to look at than racial demographic data sat uneasy with me, though. So although Alan did not directly reject this focus on race, his suggestion of more data and broader conversation and his casting of the current Zillow map as somehow insufficient or inaccurate had the effect of downplaying the importance of the racial data, recalling to a certain degree the Car2Go representatives' dependence on marketing logics to explain why particular areas were not covered by their service. So he used the light rail to explain the cost of houses as an example of how adding new data sources could paint a potentially more accurate image of the city. Yet the light rail was not just any other data source. It was the key data source implicated in public narratives of gentrification over the past few years. So racial data, on the other hand, received comparatively less attention. So arguing that more data sources brought to bear on maps, the truer the story they would tell, also rendered questions of what or whose data irrelevant. In a city comprised of largely white residents, Alan's comments revealed a technique of suppression, a way of avoiding conversations on race without being explicit. So this project sought to complement anthropological work, examining the logic that guides the hands of algorithmic systems by engaging with the designers and technologists who produce them. I invited designers to not only question the reductionist or oversimplified representations of neighborhood-based mapping, but to examine how such readings can render their own reductive capacities. So through careful examination of Yelp's best match algorithm and the modes of representation it engenders, for example, Dork Posters was able to construct a sometimes difficult to see image of the city, an image that began to expose the logics that underlie the designs circulated by elite design and technology firms. So in using parody as a form of engagement, this work also brought a sense of irony and levity and curiosity to the process of inquiry, in order to elicit conversations and insights that would have likely otherwise been missed. So the maps then served as kind of a design probe to spur these conversations with the very technologists and designers responsible for producing these representations. So the use of parody as a proposition and an engagement, so broadening mechanisms by which we apprehend the social and political capacities of design. So in an effort to look toward the periphery, this project created openings rather than solutions. By parodying the style of a poster company celebrated within modernist design circles, we began to explore how the universalizing the vision of design kind of casts over the work that is produced. So it can too often make invisible important aspects of what is being represented. In the case of Alan, for instance, further enumeration or adding more streams of data was positioned as exactly the move that would make visible causes of gentrification. Similarly, opening up discussion on Slack, a platform widely used by tech professionals, was treated as the ideal public forum. Yet others remained open to what the map revealed. I later learned, for instance, that in response to this project, an attendee at the first workshop, the first public encounter at the Data Science Center, focused his next visualization classroom on questions of civic participation. So inciting projects on mapping police brutality and environmental policy, for instance. So the intervention exposed the cracks and absences, often left unseen under all the white space, making them available and newly actionable. So these questions, probing differential representation and access in public life through design, continue with the second case of this talk on the reparative Internet of Things, a project investigating the role of IoT devices in maintaining public resource accessibility. So over the last decade or so, technologists and researchers have increasingly helped articulate and imagine the possibility of a civic Internet of Things. So connected devices distributed throughout a city to contribute to public engagement, governance, and coordinated action. From pollution sensing to foraging, scholars, including Eric Pellis in his lab, have used IoT devices to instrument urban landscapes, giving new momentum to the phrase smart cities. But less visible in this body of research is a thorough accounting for design's role in what repair studies scholar Lara Houston has called the timeliness of such encounters, or the ways in which computational remainders, fragments, and breakdowns may not be contained in the tidier stories of prototyping we circulate as design researchers. So Riot investigates the work to maintain public IoT around an important but often underexamined and over-stigmatized topic, menstrual hygiene resource accessibility, contributing both a rich case study of IoT development while exploring what it takes to move an activist IoT project beyond the prototyping stage. Specifically, I look at the device of the menstrual hygiene dispenser, an object that is often empty or broken throughout daily life, something that I've talked with many users of these and also maintainers of these to find. So with this work, I pose the question, what forms of menstrual accessibility could IoT encourage or engender? So over the past several years, shifting government policies have sparked a flurry of interest in the topic of menstruation, from local, state, and federal policy initiatives calling for free and ready access to products to the formation of over a dozen startups with tens of millions in venture capital backing. Alongside this exist longer running campaigns, including the installation of public dispensers in restrooms throughout cities, and the efforts of activists to collect and redistribute products to those unable to afford them. So drawing on fieldwork and collaboration spanning a 3-year period, I redesigned menstrual product dispensers placed in public settings by outfitting them with network sensor inserts to make them easier to stock by custodial staff and easier to access by members of the public. Specifically, I worked as a custodian and front desk volunteer at 2 hygiene centers for a total of 6 months. So these are spaces offering free access to restrooms, showers, and laundry. I also collected field notes from observations with staff at the parks and recreation departments across the city, including visiting 50 or so of their restrooms. I interviewed members of the maintenance staff as well as organizers of local and national activist organizations. And I interviewed representatives of the largest manufacturer of menstrual dispensers in the country, and social entrepreneurs who are interested in kind of affecting social change through enterprise initiatives in this space. And finally, the state and federal representatives who are introducing policy on this topic. So though all of this work informed the production of Riot, here I draw most prominently on my experiences both collaborating with and observing a local facilities organization and an intersectional feminist group to deploy this device. So I designed Riot with a small team at UW using 2 distance sensors, a low-cost microcontroller with Wi-Fi capability, and a simple portable power bank, all housed in a custom cardboard box. My proudest moment actually is the cardboard box, not any of what's inside of it. It was very intricate. So simply put, I mobilize a gap inside of the typical dispenser's cache, which becomes wider as the tampons and pads are dispensed. It's perceived by the 2 distance sensors, one for pads and one for tampons, and allows for the system to calculate the number of remaining items inside. And as the items are counted, they're posted on a web platform that provides public-facing records of the product distribution across the city. This is just what the web platform looks like. As you can see, there's the machine ID and the model, or the counts. And that's installing it. So to discuss the ways in which Riot surfaced concerns on maintenance and collective responsibility, I'm going to turn for a moment to an example during an episode of installation, where I met with building manager Felicia to institute a long-term deployment of the device in a heavily trafficked university building. So though Felicia had volunteered to be a part of the research, and although she was at first curious about the device, when I met her on campus building, she appeared to oscillate between excitement and skepticism over the course of the installation. As I told her how the system worked, for example, she said under her breath, "Just bring it from home," referring to visitors in need of menstrual products. She seemed kind of disappointed, pointing to individual accountability as the answer to the problem of too few public resources. But after a moment of reflection, she shifted tone. "Although I guess it comes in handy sometimes," she said. So her view of responsibility seemed to change over the course of the installation, from institutional to individual and back again. So this tension between individual and collective responsibility reemerged as we turned to the machine itself. So when Felicia opened the door of the dispenser, we noticed there was nothing inside. Asking if she had menstrual products to fill the machine, she responded, "Oh, you need those?" To her, the device was the solution to the problem. It was a technological standalone that would ease the burden of upkeep and make certain that visitors had the products they needed. So it seemed that tales of design solutionism had preceded me. Yet Riot was no such thing. Instead, it relied on a web of connections between maintenance, advocacy, and design intervention, kind of interdependent, much like the relationships that gave rise to it. So without products already in place, we were unable to calibrate the device. Without calibration, the device was unable to count the products, and without the count, we were left facing an empty, under-considered machine once again. So this revelation exposed something about the design that I had not yet considered. The machines had to be filled in order for the system to work. So it highlighted an assumption that I was making about the types of enrollment that I was asking from my collaborators. Namely, I expected them to know where to locate products. But this insight also represented an immediate intervention into the way that maintenance practice worked. The machines had to be filled right then and right there. So after calling a crew member to locate products, Felicia found pads in a supply closet nearby, but the tampons were all the way over in the tower, a building easily a half-mile away from where we stood. As she went to retrieve them, I waited by the open machine, with visitors to the restroom commenting, "Thank you," and "Finally!" Continuing to stand there, I found a tiny ripped Post-it note stuck to the door next to the lever for the tampons. "Empty, unhappy face, July 2017. The dispenser had been unfilled for months, but not without notice from the menstruating public. So as the fieldwork continued, I noticed custodians pass by the dispenser as well, peeking into the restroom when they saw me standing there. "Are we going to do that again?" one woman asked as she passed by on her way through the hall, referring to stocking the machine. "We just had to do it a long time ago. Are we starting again this year?" She continued. When I described the Riot project and the installation, she nodded and continued walking. Minutes later, from another custodial professional, "Are we supposed to do that?" Marked by my presence, the machine gained new attention and prompted questions on responsibility. Whose duty was it to maintain these machines? For visitors who moved through the space during the installation, there seemed to be a quiet desire for the dispensers to be kept by maintenance staff. But when the job was left undone, there was only small evidence of resistance in the form of a tiny Post-it note. Custodial staff, on the other hand, expressed curiosity, asking if it might be something under their authority to do. So when Felicia returned from this mile-long journey, she had 2 large trash bags filled with individually wrapped tampons and pads. She began filling the dispenser and asked me again how the system worked. So walking through the different components, I described how each part what each part did and how it communicated with the online system. In response, Felicia's face relaxed a little bit. She said that she hoped the platform would help the managing facilities organization see just how difficult it was for the building managers to maintain these machines. Custodians were not allowed to fill the dispenser, she told me. Instead, building managers or their superiors had to go between all the buildings under their supervision, empty the coins, and fill the machines with more product. So this work currently sits outside of their regular duties of maintaining employee schedules and involves overseeing the facilities of many buildings at once, which means it often goes undone, she admitted. So those closest to and arguably with greater knowledge of the individual restrooms in their care, the custodians who maintain them, were not entrusted with the replenishment in the machines because of the money handling involved. Felicia laughed at the thought of this and offered to count the money inside in front of me. So pulling out a smaller key, she opened a metal box in the interior of the dispenser and counted the coins. 225. She counted again just to be sure. Yep, 225, laughing. So through this encounter with Felicia, I gained a deeper understanding of the forms of labor enacted and made invisible in public sites such as restrooms. So my presence during this installation prompted reflection on the varied responsibilities expected of and entrusted to those maintaining restrooms. It surfaced larger questions on individual accountability and collective responsibility in regards to public resources. So what is and isn't considered vital to maintaining and sustaining a healthy public? Who is expected to supply the material to support it? So in some ways, these questions are made all the more fascinating by the fact that I only encountered them at what might have been considered the end of a traditional design encounter, the deployment. So this case suggests that design of public IoT takes not only work, but certain kinds of collective responsibility that meaningfully extend IoT methods within the design community. So the intervention reveals for design researchers the types of accountabilities held by different organizational actors and the class nature of those commitments. In this case, custodial staff were not interested in the $2.25 sitting within each dispenser. Yet the organization shifted responsibility and authority for emptying such coins away from such staff, ultimately making the majority of machines unusable. So here, the rules and policies guiding practices of those attending to these restrooms reflected deeply entrenched power differentials and forestalled forms of collective responsibility that could exist, highlighting the importance of attending to the conditions of one's deployment site. So alongside finding a power outlet or securing a particular IoT device, the historical and political matter of IoT may just as critically inform how an intervention works. So in addition to focusing on particular utilitarian gains, Riot exposes how IoT can also work as what Sherry Turkle might call an evocative object, contributing to wider debates on access, resource distribution, and public health. So it is in this ability to inspire and engage and imagine, and to do so collectively, that point to key implications for IoT beyond the individual. So moving it out of concerns and designs for the middle class home into the collective. So reflecting on design work beyond this specific case, I use Riot to contribute 3 key elements to research literatures on IoT, maintenance, and design activism. So first, Riot highlights forms of maintenance both expected and made possible through IoT deployments. So the deployment surfaced, for example, everything from the political stakes of municipal power grids, such as where outlets are even available in restrooms, to the subtle hierarchies of responsibility that I didn't see through interviews. Think here of Felicia's frustration with the $2.25 that managers positioned as too risky in the hands of maintenance staff. Second, this work surfaces collective responsibility as a core concern of IoT development, shaping both our ways of doing design research, so in groups rather than as individual investigators and stakeholders, as well as our way of conceptualizing it, So framing the maintenance of menstrual resources as a collective rather than individual burden. Lastly, I explore how IoT may not work only as a proof of concept, so a solution to the defined problem of public resource availability and distribution, but it may also create spaces and opportunities to reframe the very problem of access itself. So rather than casting access as solely about material resources, I identified access as an organizational concern. So in this case, located among managerial hierarchies of facility staff. So now I want to take a moment to turn to the ways that I've begun to build on these programs of research. So in expanding discussions and design experimentation on public services and care, for instance, I've developed a series of collaborative workshops meant to further reimagine infrastructures of access around menstrual maintenance. So during these meetings, several groups of lawmakers, activists, and community members worked together to investigate the limitations to current products, services, and systems in ways that were meant to reveal paths to providing more ready and reliable menstrual resources. So the concepts that emerge from these encounters range from policy to product to infrastructural intervention, all described in a resulting catalog of partial things. So one such idea detailed a network of little menstrual boxes, a la little free libraries, that would hold hygiene products along with books and information on local health resources. Another group imagined a suite of bills to be introduced to the state legislature, requiring products in schools and incentivizing businesses to do the same through tax credits. So rather than a static record of these conversations or documentation of discrete products, the booklet itself is a research object. I sent the catalog to other stakeholders who weren't able to attend the workshops in person. So it builds upon the brief encounters by enrolling others to comment, edit, revise, and further develop the ideas featured. So several more practically oriented outcomes that have emerged have included the Feminist Women's Health Center in Atlanta taking up some of the design activities of the workshop into their own kind of fellowship programs. And a student-led initiative that was formed during the first workshop launching at Georgia Tech. And finally, a US representative expressing interest in the study and taking the catalog for comment. So together, Riot, the workshop, and the dynamic catalog offer insight into what feminist philosopher Marilyn Strathern calls partial connections, or the partnerships constituted across difference, by experimenting with the scale, form, and complexity of located interventions. So looking back on discussions of periphery, my research reveals what might appear mundane or instrumental, for instance, menstrual products, their public distribution, and the care labor that sustains them, as integral to material and social innovation. So by looking at the periphery of IoT usage, for instance, my work pushes back on an inclination to propose single technological solutions for all, to instead offer partial responses, both in the variety of ideas put forth and the methods taken up. So taken together, these contributions provide kind of conceptual scaffolding toward efforts to design adaptable, community-supported, and collaboratively maintained infrastructures. So in the future, I plan to expand on these discussions by focusing on two core areas of research. So the first, I'm calling salvage enumeration, looks at the ways in which existing practices of noticing and recording bodily information are reshaped and marketed as newly valuable. So here, entrepreneurs like those with the startup Next Gen Jane and others take what has been traditionally viewed as taboo or even trash, menstrual blood, and recast it as information-rich genomic data, ripe for uses like genetic testing and stem cell banking. The other project on entrepreneurial access examines the ways in which contemporary enterprise initiatives and activities are more and more dictate the distribution of core resources. Think of shoes, water, menstrual hygiene, et cetera. So this fits within longer trajectories of activist business and unconscious capitalistic ventures of social movements past. But what might it mean as this move becomes more prevalent? How does this activity affect the other sorts of interventions and initiatives that could exist outside of the private sector? these are questions that I hope to puzzle over the coming years. Okay. So let's look back for a moment to the note I made at the beginning about this propensity to construct a universalizing image of the user, or a top-down view of who counts. So we've seen through fictional posters and IoT deployments that building critical alternatives allows us to look around rather than ahead. This way of seeing invites us to mobilize the periphery as a central site for design. Repositioning the process of design, we also reformulate it as a new opportunity, newly enlivened opportunity for both inquiry and action. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to my collaborators, especially Daniela Rosner, Meredith Lampe, Rafael da Silva, Bonnie Tran, and Lena Choi. And thank you all, especially for listening.
And let me, on behalf of us all, thank Sarah for a very good talk. I think most interesting, I hope will lead to a discussion for which we have half an hour or so. So please, if you are going to ask a question, make sure I get the microphone to you.
Oh, you're mute.
Is it on now? Okay, is that it? All right, now I think we can.
Fascinating talk, and also congratulations on winning the DIS award on your social justice paper.
Thank you.
You didn't have time to say a whole lot about it. Might you do that?
Sure. Talking specifically about the
that paper.
Yeah. So I wrote a paper with Lynn Dombrowski and Ellie Harmon on a social justice-oriented interaction design. So this was kind of a call to action of sorts, and a kind of recognition of work within the DIS community and HCI writ large toward efforts to kind of dismantle systems of oppression through material production. And we did so by explaining and kind of doing a survey of existing research across the field of HCI, but also in adjoining fields like urban study or urban planning and design, kind of recognizing different facets that might that might be important to considering in doing design-oriented work towards social change.
Do you know Isha Ray in our energy resources group? She's done a lot of work
Nice.
on social justice and menstruation.
Awesome.
And differences in men's and women's bathrooms and business models in the developing world.
Oh, fantastic.
You might really
Yes.
connect your IoT work with that because she's got a lot of data. She's been working with the United Nations. It is preventing women from getting jobs in the field in the country, and if they can't use the toilet at work, sometimes they'll come to work without drinking anything all day working in the fields.
Yes.
Be interesting to connect the dots.
Yes, absolutely. That's a nice point that you bring up about kind of movement through public life. As kind of trans activists across the country have highlighted, if you can't use the restroom, you can't really spend much time outside of your own home. So it's important kind of for mobility, quite literally, but also, kind of access to education and professional access and things like that. So yes.
If there are social pressures, you can't just pee in the field.
Right. Yep. It might even introduce you to violence or danger. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. I'm interested in your ethnographic approach, and I wonder, are you from Atlanta, one?
Yes.
And two, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. So, but anyway, I'm interested because I think a lot of this design thinking gets shaped by where people are from, and sometimes they worry, and their experiences, obviously. And so I'm wondering if you felt that had any influence on what you chose to look at, and how you think about how we have a very limited sort of geographical, I think, sometimes of the people that are doing a lot of this design tech work.
Okay. So you're saying that where one is from influences the way in which they approach design?
So, yeah, not just where one is from, but also I think there are certainly like tech hotspots we're in one, and you can also push back on that premise. Sorry, I don't come from the design school, but it's just something I think about.
Oh no, I'm so interested in what you're saying. Please, continue.
Yeah, if you think that having, maybe, I don't know if there are a lot of people you know that are also not from the Bay Area that come from different perspectives, and if you think that, or how that has shaped your research.
Oh, like I am on the periphery because I'm from not Silicon Valley. Yeah. So that's something I hadn't quite considered, although, moving from Atlanta to Seattle, it did become, very clear that there was just a difference in wealth of the city and kind of the makeup of the city because of the presence of tech development. And that is even more exaggerated here, I'm sure, compared to there. But yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah. Certainly it does matter, yeah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. And we've, with many of the PhD students here, we've been talking quite a lot about critical design approaches. And I think one sort of critique that has emerged is how it can become very disengaged from, on one extreme, maybe there's tech solutionism. On the other extreme, there's a sort of art practice that isn't, that kind of performs user-centeredness, but is really kind of disinterested in certain ways with actual people's needs. And I'm wondering how you kind of navigate, because this work looks like it's very much about social impact and about, understanding a work environment, understanding the needs of a particular population of people who need menstrual hygiene products. I just am kind of interested in your thoughts about critical design and its sort of problematic extremes.
Yeah. I think that's something that I've kind of swam in for a while, kind of thinking about the different poles that there might be there. So on one end, I do want to present something that would be, useful and, potentially beneficial, or at least not harmful to the people I'm working with. On the other hand, I don't want to present kind of, one of the fears that I had with the dispenser in particular was that it might suggest a kind of a technological solutionism that I did not want it to, which is part of the reason that I led a series of workshops in the first place. It was kind of born out of this frustration with the kind of limitations of more traditional design models, and relying on kind of concepts in feminist technoscience and anthropology that view the world as kind of, our perspectives of the world as partial and fractal, and kind of trying to represent that through design too. To not have it be this kind of relegated thing off in the world of capital D design or within computer science departments or whatever it may be, but instead to kind of open it up and have it be a site of interrogation as well, not just for me, but also those I am collaborating with or working with in the field.
Yeah, thank you. It's really fun to hear you talk. So I had a strong reaction. On your first project, you did the mapping and then you shared it, which I thought was great. And the goal was to illuminate partly how the homogenizing sort of view of product design misses all sorts of things. And so the guy that comes up to you and says, there's all sorts of other variables. I thought, well, yeah, race might be one cut, but income is another cut. There are many different ways. And so, he may have been dismissive of race as a variable, but it seems to me he was opening up a whole set of sort of complexities that I felt like you were dismissing. I don't think you wanted to, but.
Yeah. My intention was not necessarily to dismiss, but to kind of highlight that tendency to kind of pile on more and more layers on this, mapping in particular. Flipping on.
So maps always tell stories.
Yes.
So you were telling one story, but does that mean another story couldn't be told?
Not at all. I think that there are, a million and one stories that could be told with these maps. And I think, my effort was not to kind of explain gentrification, but rather to kind of raise this to the surface as an important thing to look at. And in kind of shedding away the multitude of layers that are often featured on maps. It was an effort to kind of highlight this and highlight the reductionist nature. The discomfort with the fact that it was represented this way was actually one thing that was like a feature of what I wanted it to do. I wanted it to kind of, it needed to be weird and unsettling enough to start the conversation.
So, okay, one more.
Yeah.
I get that Yelp was reductionist and Car2Go was reductionist, but you were too.
Yes, right. Exactly.
This is always political. People make choices.
Yes. Yeah.
So I was hoping you could talk, we've used your social justice by design
right, which I think is a really nice contribution to thinking about the role of design and different ways of bringing values to the surface. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your critique of design processes and some of the critique generally of kind of everybody, right? I'm a lawyer, we all want to do design, right? Like regulation by design, privacy by design, security by, right? It's like design thinking has run amok at some level. But I'm interested, right? You then had a series of workshops that seemed to be kind of designerly. I saw lots of Post-it notes. It looked like you were doing and so I'm wondering, what are the kind of different approaches? Are you using your own social justice framework? Are you using different kinds of methodologies? If you could talk a little bit, because there is this, for me, with critical speculative design, this question about kind of repeatability, or like if you actually do want to get to something where you have an intervention and you want to go forward, how do you, that next step seems to kind of want of more rigid design-oriented processes, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more. Really, that was a lot, but.
No, that's good. I think, tell me if I'm understanding the question correctly. So, on one end, there's this critique that exists of design and its rigidity, or typical popular design methods and its rigidity. But on the other end, we want to like produce something at the end, and we want to prototype and build on something and have it be in the world. Is that part of the question? Yeah.
Yeah. Part of it, and just it would be useful just to understand how your own approach to bringing the community together to do the kind of brainstorming, problem solving, either builds on your own distinct methodologies or builds on design methodologies, but with some different sorts of interventions to try to not fall into the trap.
Okay. Yes. So with that workshop specifically, I was kind of referencing a bit the future workshops method that kind of loosely defines kind of working from a place where you are now, so examining existing structures and systems, and then imagining kind of a utopian vision and then filling out the gaps for the majority of the workshop. That's how it was loosely structured. Kind of how that played out, I mean, that provides structure in that it tells you kind of 1, 2, 3 step, but it's getting there is not defined. So it's so that was what I used specifically there, and a lot of design workshops I think take up this kind of model. But part of the work of coming together in the workshop setting in the first place was actually drawing a lot on my kind of observational work to start with. So the folks that I had engaged with through interviews and observations were the ones that I called upon and asked to collaborate on a workshop series. So the outputs of that, I told them at the time, could be kind of tangible products, services, or proposals, or bills, one ended up being. But they could also be just kind of coming together with kind of folks who are interested in this space. So that in itself was seen as kind of a reproductive outcome of the encounter. So, there was largely some kind of expectation setting there and making sure that we were on the same page in terms of what we were getting out. But I think they also understood, because they had been in conversation with me for a while, and I introduced at the workshop, my own perspective, that this would sit in kind of a trajectory of work. I saw, the design work happening alongside the policy work, alongside the activist work. So it was never seen as like this kind of standalone thing or this solution to the problem of access. But kind of recognizing that all the activity that was kind of burgeoning up around this topic. So that was kind of the approach that I was very intentionally trying to incorporate along the way. And I think like one way of avoiding kind of getting stuck within the ruts of one particular method or kind of step-by-step processes is by kind of doing the kind of exchange. I was going to mention the design exchange. Is like kind of looking across all of the kind of design methods that are available. So recognizing that HCD is not the only way, and you don't have to kind of iterate and ideate and in that order and so on and so forth. it's much more fluid and flexible, and kind of being open to that and recognizing that things can shift even in the middle of the project, and that's okay to move with that. So hopefully that. Okay.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if you could comment a little on your thoughts on the space of IoT designs and how they're doing like maintenance work already, and then how you see Riot as situated in that space or contrasting that space.
So you're saying existing products on IoT products and products?
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you have a specific example that, are you thinking of like Nest thermostat?
Yeah,
or? Okay.
comparing to Nest or other smart home technology sensing, or just comparing to like what kind of inspired your thoughts on developing what is an IoT project, but which might sit a little differently in the space, or how you situate that in the broader space.
So I think when I was beginning this project, I was thinking a lot about kind of the space of IoT and what work it was doing. So I was looking at products like Nest that are meant to kind of moderate temperatures in middle-class homes. So to a certain extent, it kind of offloads the responsibility of kind of turning down the dial, kind of keeps that thought out of our mind and ensures that we are being sustainable with our individual actions. But I wondered what, or how design, or maintenance might be construed outside of that individualized kind of understanding of responsibility. In that case, it was kind of efforts towards sustainability, but in the case of Riot, it was sustainability of another kind, I guess, sustainability of mineral resources. It was kind of viewing it as collectivist, as kind of interested in the public and public resources, and kind of taking a political stance. Whereas I think, IoT coming out of the corporate sector very intentionally does not take a kind of political stance, although I guess you could construe sustainability as political, but I don't. So I was thinking about all of that, and it was really meant to be kind of, in a sense, an activity that would prompt discussion even among designers and technologists to say, like, what if we removed this? What if we removed this from the intimate space of the home and brought it into the intimate space of the public, where we're not interested in just kind of thinking about the individual and kind of keeping bills down, but also the health of the public. So these were all, circulating in my mind at the time.
Thank you. It was very interesting. While I was listening, I was fascinated by the policy story. And in one view, I can see both of these projects that you showed us as sort of using a design process and thereby affecting some change in policy or policy thinking. But one thing that struck me was that I can see how the change in policy might have come most directly from interacting with the designer as opposed to the actual sort of product or the final product. And maybe one thing that leaves me questioning is that can't really scale so much. So I wonder, we can't send sort of designers off into every restroom in the country, for example. So I wonder if your work has given you some idea of how, as a policy angle, can these gains that we see make a broader impact? Right. That's a great question. So my first impulse is to say, but you can through teaching, to say like training kind of critical interrogation of designs and technologies, kind of training designers and technologists to think critically about what they're doing, can kind of can extend into industry, can extend into policy by kind of the jobs that people take up after their schooling. That's one thought. But I mean, I think another thing that I found through doing this work, so thinking about scale, so I may be one individual person and I may be only able to interact with a certain set of people over the course of doing my work, but efforts like the catalog of partial things, for instance, was one to kind of try to scale. It was to try to interface with as many people as possible and to move kind of into different sectors without having my own kind of cost on me personally
to actually travel to these places. So it was a way of extending the design process beyond like these brief encounters, like I said in the talk. So that was one way. But yeah, I think also teaching is a great way of doing that work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when we met this morning, you talked about one of these advocacy groups you worked with was putting their backing behind a bill, and that you actually testified about this bill. So I'm, that there's policy. What was the bill about? What, how did it relate to your project?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So the group that I collaborated with in deploying the device, for instance, one of them was a facilities organization, and the other was a feminist group who were interested in the device because of the kind of data collection potential it had. So they were interested in writing a bill and asking for support from a congressperson, a state congressperson, to make products freely available in public schools and shelters and prisons. But they had no real kind of idea about how much that would cost and how implementation would happen necessarily, because there was one bill that had been introduced in New York City, but that was it, and it hadn't been implemented yet. So they saw this as a way of kind of charting progress over time and kind of recognizing how much potentially this could cost and scale. So they came to the project with that in mind. So they saw this as a data advocacy tool, something that they could extract information about this practice. So that's why they were interested in collaborating with me in the first place. They saw utility in this. But they also, kind of midway through our engagement together, came to me about a bill that was introduced to the state legislature asking for the removal of sales tax on tampons and pads. So this, and they asked if I might want to join them at the Capitol in Olympia. So I did. I went along, and they encouraged me to also testify. So I told stories from the observational work that I had done in day centers on kind of the difficulties of gaining access to these products, and having kind of additional cost burden on them was doing no favors to these folks that I was interviewing. And there were plenty of health concerns that were raised in these interviews. So folks who described using socks instead of products and then washing them in the tub with no soap. So obviously that is something important to address from a public health perspective. So these are things that I shared in the testimony. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit, you may or may not know, but if you know, so the document of partial objects, I don't know, what partial solutions?
Things, yeah.
Partial things, is not the normal missive one sends to Congress or to the state legislature, or it's not, you don't go to a briefing and plop down things that look like they're kind of sewed together.
Yeah.
But sometimes policymakers respond to the novelty, and so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as an intervention and what sort of response it provoked.
Yeah, that's a great point. I actually delivered that by hand. So I happened to be in DC, so I stopped by the House of Representatives, and it was the day that, it was actually kind of recently, it was the day that the tax bill passed the House. So as I was delivering this object, I heard ding, 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 which represented the votes for it to pass. So it was kind of demoralizing for me as a grad student. but I was there delivering this object. And honestly, I mean, it was kind of interesting. I didn't think, knowing that they were voting on this, I was like, how are they making time for me right now? But they, the representative took the catalog and was just, totally intrigued by it. It was just it did not fit with anything that was there. There's lots of paper ephemera around, but nothing that looked like that, nothing in color. So yeah, we kind of just stepped through the different designs and described what they were about. this person had particular interest in the policy ideas that were put forth. But yeah, I mean, just, we also talked a little bit about, so there's a museum of menstruation